So Monday evening, the president put out his pick to replace the vacated seat on the Supreme Court by Anthony Kennedy. There was a lot of speculation over who he was going to pick, and most people on the right were pretty excited about Amy Barrett, and most people on the left thought that anybody who was going to go in there was going to be a detriment to the society that they built. But it wound up being Brett Kavanaugh, and I'm pretty excited about this. The D.C. Circuit Court judge that had worked on the Ken Starr probe and had worked in other facets of the Bush administration is going to be a really good pick, I think. He's a really good constitutionalist, but he is still kind of a little bit squishy on middle of the road issues and issues that are important to the left. That's kind of what I was saying that we needed to have all along, especially going into this midterm. The thing that's going to be important when it comes down to the Senate review process and the confirmation is going to be that Kavanaugh does stand that Roe versus Wade is going to have to stand in the courts as a precedent. Now, a lot of people on the right don't like this, and personally I think it should be kicked back to the states, but it's going to be a hard thing for people that are on the pro-choice movement to sit and confirm away from him when Kavanaugh has already come out and said that he's going to support this decision. But that hasn't stopped the people on the far left, and most of the protest was going on even before Kavanaugh was nominated as the presumptive justice to be. I mean, when you really look at the situation, the propaganda was already out there and going towards the impressionable college students who felt that the country had betrayed them. Campus Reform USA did a very good video on this.
I think the big thing that's been in the news today, Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy stepping down, so there's a vacancy. All week people were worried about who it was going to be. This week he made his announcement. What's your reaction to the justice that he nominated today?
I'm honestly not surprised by his choice, but that's just worse for us.
I just saw the pick and I was like, it's almost at a point where you kind of expect that it's not going to be what you want.
He's quite, extreme in his views, and I don't know if it would make the Supreme Court very even.
Now, it's unclear who funded this, but the day before Kavanaugh was nominated, there was already a march forming in D.C., and mysteriously, they already had printed signs, professionally printed signs saying hashtag resist Kavanaugh and hashtag not my justice. Now, the not my justice signs still hold true, but you have to think if they already had printed signs up, they had to have been doing this before Kavanaugh was nominated. And sure enough, there has been a discovery of a stack of signs that said hashtag resist Barrett, or any number of other people that were on the list that Donald Trump said he was going to nominate from, even when he was on the campaign trail. And once again, even before the nomination came out, and this is when most of the people on the right were anticipating that Amy Barrett was going to be the next justice, there were a couple of women in Arizona, and this blows my mind because this was the Arizona heat, and it's summer in Arizona just like it's summer here. But these two women felt that they needed to walk around in the Arizona heat in Handmaid's Tale costumes because they fear that anybody that Trump puts onto the Supreme Court is going to force women to have any babies that they conceive. Now, I'm not necessarily in favor of coming up and starting an abortion argument. That's an argument for another time, and on another video I'll sit down and tell you when I feel the decision to not have a baby should have taken place rather than when it's taking place commonly, apparently, across the country. But I do want to point this out. Wouldn't it be nice, and stay with me for a moment, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to be afraid of who the SCOTUS pick was going to be? Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to worry every time the president says he wants to sign an executive order? Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to worry about who the president was in office currently? Our country is moving dangerously into a more centralized state, and unfortunately it's not a state that our founders ever intended. It's the reason that we had individual states distributed across our union to begin with. Now, I feel a lot of the same way about the Congress of the United States. I think they're putting way too many regulations that sweep across this entire country and affect almost everybody in the country, and I'd like to talk about that in another video down the road. But my real problem with the centralization of government and the fact that people do feel completely afraid by the fact that Donald Trump is in office right now and who he could pick for the SCOTUS, as demonstrated by the campus reform video that came out before there was even a SCOTUS pick, is the fact that both the Supreme Court and the executive branch are not supposed to be legislating in the first place. Last week when I talked about Kennedy's retirement, I cited both Ben Shapiro and Sean Hannity, two people with very different ideas of our current sitting president and the way that our federal government should be run. But both of them like to say the same phrase, legislate from the bench. And a lot of people rightly like to say legislate from the bench when they talk about Roe versus Wade, in addition to a couple of other overturned precedencies that came from the Supreme Court already. Now, just doing a quick Google search right now shows that Roe versus Wade is something that's really trending among left-wing outlets. It's something that everybody's been talking about from the moment that Kennedy decided that he was going to resign from the Supreme Court. And a lot of that comes from the fact that it really does seem like it's an important decision in American society today. I remember learning about Roe versus Wade as a 7th grader when I was 12. And I don't necessarily believe it was appropriate for me to be learning about it at that time. I barely had just started looking at girls at the time, and so had most of the guys my age. But societal talk aside, Roe versus Wade is a great example of legislate from the bench. Now, up until recently, a right to abortion, or a law saying that you could have a right to abortion, would be something that would be hard to get across a legislation. Within my lifetime, the scope of abortion changed from something that should be shameful and something that should be rare and something that people should grieve about when it does have to happen into something that you should be celebrating. So now I think if the Democrats would ever be able to come together and get a majority back in legislation, it is a law they would be able to pass on a federal level. But we're not here for a civics lesson right now. Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court appeal in which the Supreme Court in '73 decided that every woman had the right to an abortion across the federal level. And I stand with a majority of right-leaning commentators when I say that this is something that should have been kicked back to the states. It shouldn't be decided on a federal level, especially from the bench. Now, the genuine fear that goes around the decision is the fact that if Roe v. Wade were to get overturned in the court, which, depending on how Kavanaugh feels when he gets into there, could actually happen, at least within our lifetime, then that would mean that abortion is now illegal and a woman has to carry a baby to term no matter what. And this is simply not true. Should it be overturned, abortion would now become a discretionary tactic, and it would be on localities, municipalities, counties, states, or the federal government to decide what is legal and what is not. And yes, this still could be a federal issue, as I mentioned before. This could be legislated through the House and Senate. I would prefer that it wasn't legislated that way, but as long as it was legally legislated through the articles of the Constitution, I would live with it. But going back to the original conversation, this just demonstrates one federal regulation that has no business being legislated bench. And a lot of that goes the same with executive orders. Congress pushed our president to make an executive order saying that families could no longer be separated at the border, something that Congress should have been legislating the entire time, even back in the Obama. It's funny, and a lot of this goes back to things that were said about Donald Trump on the campaign, and things that are said about him now that he is the president. He's going to make this law, he's going to make that law, he's going to make X law, Y law, etc. The president doesn't make laws. The president, as the executive branch head, is the chief law enforcement officer of the country, in essence. Congress makes the laws. The Supreme Court decides if the law is constitutional by the articles and the amendments, and the president enforces the law. When you boil it right down, any executive order, whether it came from W, whether it came from Obama, or whether it comes from Trump, is just the executive branch deciding which laws they are going to enforce and which ones they are not. That's what DACA is, by the way. And that's a part of the reason that so many of Obama's misguided laws that he wrote with his pen and his phone went away so quickly at the beginning of the Trump presidency. Because Trump decided to come out and make executive orders saying, no, now we are going to enforce these laws, or we're not going to enforce these non-laws in some of the other cases. And a lot of this takes me back now to the original question I posed at the beginning of this video. Wouldn't it be nice if the federal government didn't have this much power? And when I bring this topic up, I'm also bringing the legislation into the same topic. I've read the Constitution, and I'm in the process of reading the Federalist Papers right now. And one thing that I can tell you from reading the text and reading the Federalist Papers is that the federal government was never intended by the founders to have as much power as it currently wields. And there were never supposed to be this many overarching laws coming from Washington, D.C. to govern all of the people all the way across the continent. Now, most of these laws that we are following on the federal level are legislated legally, so you really can't fault the legislators for doing what we elect them to do, but you can fault the fact that we elected legislators that wanted to have this many laws coming out at a federal level, rather than letting states decide and localities and municipalities. Now, I've never actually expressly read this written anywhere, but reading the subtext, I feel that this was the intention of the fathers. So this is my interpretation of the way that they structured the government. Our government was intended to be structured in a way that the majority of the laws that you lived under, you had a choice whether or not you wanted to live under. And that's why we set up a state system rather than an overbearing federal government in the 18th century. If you lived in Massachusetts in the mid-2000s, like 2005 on to 2009, you remember what Romney Care was, and it was the precursor to Obamacare. I never took residency in Massachusetts. I always retained my residency as being in Wisconsin in the 2 years that I lived there, and that's because Romney Care was an overbearing state government regulation that was a hardship on anybody who wasn't in a decent job. Part of the way that he was able to implement it was the fact that the majority of people in Massachusetts do actually have really good jobs. It's kind of a rarity, especially now, for someone of an adult age to be working at a minimum wage job. It happens, it's just more rare than it is in other parts of the country. But in New England, if you didn't like the way that the Massachusetts tax structure was made, or if you didn't want to live under Romney Care, but you still wanted to be close to your family, you always had the option to move to New Hampshire, who has no state sales tax, and no income tax, I might add. And you were still right there close enough where you could still go visit your family in Massachusetts, or you could still go and visit some of the founding areas, some of the historical sites. You just didn't have to live under that law. I use the ACA as an example because it's one of the hottest button issues to ever come out of the federal government in my lifetime that was actually legislated. Most people, and I am on the party of those most people, believe that the ACA should have been put through the 10th when it was decided to be constitutional when it went through the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court was serving its initial purpose. That should have been referred to as a 10th Amendment item, an item that wasn't covered in the original articles or any of the 9 amendments that were prior to the 10th, and should have been kicked back to the states. That way, if Minnesota wanted a full single-payer healthcare system, Wisconsin wanted to be complete free market, and Illinois wanted to be an ACA light just for Illinois, I would choose to live in Wisconsin, which I do anyway because I like the weather and climate. and avoid working and living in Minnesota. The single payer system would work well for Minnesota because they would have voted it in, and the ACA system would have worked essentially for the people of Illinois because they voted it in, and all of the people in all of those states would be happy, and the ones that dissented would migrate to one of the other 3 states. I'm going to go back and pick on Illinois one more time because Illinois has some of the strictest gun laws in the nation. And even still, they have one of the highest gun crime rates in the nation. But I'm going to leave that out because we've talked about that before, and I intend we're going to talk about that again sometime in the future. But the fact of the matter is I don't live in Illinois. I live in Wisconsin, where we don't have such strict gun laws. We have some, but they're not nearly as strict as they are in the state immediately to my south. Illinois legislated gun laws in a way that they felt was going to work for their states, and the people who choose not to live under those gun laws live in other states, either Missouri, Wisconsin, Iowa, or Indiana. And I know it kind of sucks a little bit for the downstaters, but such is life. The majority of your voting bloc lives in one city in your state. So the people in Springfield are trying to cater to that majority of your voting bloc. I did have an argument one time with a more liberal friend of mine. We were actually talking about health care going back to the ACA, and I was stating my position that it should be a state decision because people in different states do have different needs, and her immediate counter was that not health care was different. Everybody needs health care. Everybody does need health care. You're not going to live forever, and you're not going to make it on homeopathic medicine, even though many people have tried, and I applaud their decision. But just to look to the 2 people that were in that particular argument. My friend is a young, in her 20s, single mother with a now double digits age child who's creeping on the edge of teenager. Wow, that's getting scary. I've known them since he was 1. And I am a single male, never married, no children. My friend and I have very different healthcare needs just between the 2 of us. I may need a checkup every year and a plan that covers me if I get a cold to a point that I can't move. She needs vaccinations, school checkups, high-risk checkups because children's immune systems are still developing, plus anything that she needs for herself, especially women's health, being a woman herself and I a man. So as I mentioned before, just the 2 people in that argument have very different healthcare needs. My sister and I have very different healthcare needs because she has 2 kids and is unmarried, and I have no kids. Even my parents and I have different healthcare needs. They don't have any children living at home right now, this is true, but the 24-year age difference between the 3 of us means that they need to go and see doctors more often than I do, even though maybe I should go and see a doctor a little bit more than I do. Healthcare is not an overarching thing. Even in the same state, I would be willing to let regulations go to a municipality because people in Milwaukee have different healthcare needs than people in rural Wausau or other northern Wisconsin smaller cities. People in Milwaukee should have gunshot insurance for when they get shot and they have to go to the hospital. And yet, so much of this power wants to be legislated at the federal level. And the biggest fear that we're looking at right now is whether or not something can be legislated from the bench on a federal level from a branch of government that has no business legislating. I've been reading some of Kavanaugh's records since Monday in the evening when I found out that he was going to be the nominee. I think he's going to do good on the Supreme Court. I think he's going to hold the status quo, which is going to be important going into the midterms. I think it's going to be a little bit harder for the left to get the votes together to impeach our president, which I know is part of their plan. And I think given his record and some of the things that he says, and especially some of the things that the left feared with a floating nomination coming up, I think it's going to be really easy to get Kavanaugh confirmed as a justice of the Supreme Court. Chuck Schumer is sitting around right now trying to flip a few Republicans so that he can get Donald Trump his choice denied going into the midterm, so this continues to be a single issue vote. But given some of Kavanaugh's record and some of the cases that he's worked, I think he's going to flip a few Democrats to his side instead. Unless they have the absolute solidarity mentality that I think Chuck Schumer wants them to have, I think he might grab a couple of them from the left and say, hey, this guy's not so bad. It's like Kennedy 2.0 almost. So I think the president made the right decision, and even looking at some of Kavanaugh's record, maybe he will take a look at some of the things that have been legislated from either the Congress, the executive branch, or the bench itself that should have been left to a state decision or maybe even a locality in a municipality. I'd love to see the structure of our government change back to the point of if there is a law that's made that somebody doesn't particularly agree with, the legislator has to wonder if he's going to have to lock eyes with that particular person that's dissenting in a grocery store. This anonymous government over in D.C., where most of its members will never have to see their constituents or meet them, is a power structure that is starting to need to end. This Supreme Court pick should really start opening people's eyes to the fact that the federal government has way too much power, and maybe it's time to change that. What do you think about this particular Supreme Court pick? Do you think he'll be confirmed? Do you have any reasons that he can't be confirmed? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comment section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at edsblogtwitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care, everyone.